My name is Meredith Martin. I'm currently at the NC State University, but I'm going to be presenting on work that I did as a postdoc at Yale School of the Environment with co-authors from Yale and from the Nature Conservancy. This project was an assessment of tree planting and reforestation projects in the tropics and subtropics around the world. And there's been a real increase in interest in tree planting as a solution to many social and environmental problems, but very little assessment on the broad scale of what these tree planting organizations and tree planting projects are actually doing, or at least what they're reporting to be doing. So we compiled a database of 174 unique organizations that are engaging in tree planting and reforestation in the tropics and subtropics. We found these through a combination of Google searches of Global Giving and Charity Navigator, treenation.org. And for all of the organizations that met our criteria, we recorded a large amount of information on the organizations, on where they worked, where they were headquartered, the number of trees planted, the reforestation restoration methods they used, and the species that they report using. And we found that overall, there's been a real dramatic increase in the number of organizations dedicated to tree planting and tropical reforestation in the last few decades, which isn't a surprise. We also found that the headquarters of these organizations were much more commonly located in the global north, even though many of the projects are found in the global south. And we found that overall, organizations reported planting a total of 1.4 billion trees since 1961. We also calculated the reported mean annual rate from all of these organizations, and we found that it would still take over 1,000 years to plant 1 trillion trees, which has been named as a goal by many of these kind of broad-scale tree planting initiatives. I also want to note that these numbers are all self-reported by the organizations, so we were not, of course, able to independently verify whether they have in fact planted these number of trees or restored the area that they said. We also found that the species that organizations report using, by and large, tended to be utilitarian species. So by that, we mean species that have some sort of commercial timber or fruit or agricultural service or product. This is a list of the top 7 most commonly reported species. So we have cacao, we have teak, moringa, mango, coffee, mahogany, and avocado, all commercial species, of course. And we see that they're often being planted well outside of their native ranges. So in bold are countries where they're being planted that are within the native range, and in italics are countries where they're being planted outside of the native range. And this interest in utilitarian species is really mirrored in the restoration reforestation techniques that these organizations report using. So almost half report using agroforestry as a reforestation technique, and many fewer report using more sort of natural ecological methods such as assisted natural regeneration or relying on natural regeneration. And this is just a small sample of the different techniques that people reported. But I also want to note that there was a real lack of specificity and information on the type of reforestation technique used. So about half of organizations didn't even specify what type of method they were using, beyond saying planting. And again, many organizations didn't report any of the species, and of those that we did, almost a quarter mentioned only a single species, and half reported fewer than 5 species. And we see that these organizations really are trying to meet multiple objectives by using these utilitarian species and these utilitarian methods. So based on the mission statements, we found a lot of commonly used words had to do with people and economic development, which makes sense based on these species. But we also found that a lot had to do with conservation and biodiversity. And so, of course, tropical reforestation can achieve multiple benefits, but there are also going to be trade-offs depending on the species that are used. And additionally, we want to note that there may be a risk going forward if this same suite of species is being commonly planted throughout the world in the tropics and subtropics. There may be a risk of some sort of homogenization of flora over time. Finally, regardless of what species are used, we found that very few organizations discussed monitoring on their websites or in their reports. Only 18% mentioned monitoring at all, and only 8% mentioned measuring survival. And this is obviously enormously important, as ultimately the number of trees that are planted doesn't matter nearly as much as the number of trees that survive. And so ultimately, we think that there really needs to be clearer communication between the donors, the organization, and the scientific community on what's being done and what would be best practices. Thank you very much.